Tunisia, March 23, 1943. The earth trembled. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his face into the sand as the American artillery screamed overhead. Not the hollow whistle of the 88s he knew, but a deeper, more terrible roar that spoke of industrial abundance he had only heard whispered about in the ranks. The air tasted of cordite and blood. His left leg, shattered by shrapnel from a Sherman's machine gun, burst 20 minutes earlier, had stopped hurting, a mercy that terrified him more than the pain itself. Through the smoke and dust, he heard boots crunching toward him. American voices. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but his fingers found only sand. The Luger was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the retreat. This was the end then. Everything he had been told about the Americans, the stories whispered in the barracks about torture, about savagery, about the brutality of the mongrel army from across the Atlantic, flooded his mind as a shadow fell across his face. "Medic! We got a live one here!" The voice was young, urgent, almost concerned. Klaus squinted through the haze. An American soldier, barely older than 18, knelt beside him. The boy's hands, surprisingly gentle, were already applying a tourniquet to Klaus's mangled leg. Behind him, another GI was preparing a stretcher. No interrogation, no rifle butt to the skull, just efficiency, speed, and something Klaus had not expected to encounter on this day: medical care. Within 40 minutes, he would later marvel at this, counting the minutes obsessively in his memory. Klaus Hartmann found himself on an operating table in a field hospital 6 miles behind the American lines. The morphine had taken hold, softening the edges of reality, but he remained conscious enough to register the impossibility of what was happening. A surgeon, a major with tired eyes and steady hands, worked over his leg. Nurses moved with practiced precision. There was no waiting, no triage line where enemy wounded languished until Americans were treated. He was simply a patient, a human being whose leg needed saving. "You're lucky, Jerry," the surgeon said in accented but comprehensible German. "Another hour and you'd have lost it. We'll get you patched up." Klaus tried to respond, but the anesthesia mask descended over his face, and the world dissolved into chemical darkness. His last conscious thought was a question that would haunt him for the remainder of the war. Why? The answer to that question would unfold slowly across 26 months of captivity that would reshape Klaus Hartmann's understanding of the world more profoundly than 4 years of Nazi indoctrination ever had. He was not alone in his confusion. By the war's end, over 375,000 German prisoners of war would pass through the gates of American POW camps, the vast majority held not in Europe, but in the continental United States itself. They came from every theater: the Afrika Korps veterans like Klaus, captured in Tunisia or Sicily, U-boat crews pulled from the Atlantic's depths, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France, Wehrmacht soldiers swept up in the great surrenders of 1944 and 45. They arrived expecting brutality and found something that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. The confusion began the moment they stepped off the trains. Camp Alva, Oklahoma, July 1943. Klaus, his leg still healing but saved by American surgery, descended onto a platform in the middle of what seemed like an infinite expanse of prairie. The heat was crushing, alien, nothing like the Mediterranean sun he had known. But what struck him first was not the heat. It was the sheer space of everything. The camp stretched across acres of flat land, row upon row of newly constructed barracks that looked nothing like the photographs of Soviet camps the propaganda ministry had circulated. These buildings were solid, painted, with real windows and screens against insects. A sergeant with a clipboard and remarkably good German gestured toward the nearest barracks. "Welcome to Alva, gentlemen. You'll find your bunk assignments posted inside. Mess hall opens at 0600, 1200, and 1800. Work details begin tomorrow for those who volunteer. Pay is 80 cents per day, credited to your account. Klaus exchanged glances with Feldwebel Otto Richter, a tank commander captured the same day. Both men wore identical expressions of bewilderment. Pay for prisoners? Surely he's joking, Otto muttered in German, but the sergeant had already moved on, processing the next group with the same bureaucratic efficiency. The barracks interior deepened their confusion. 20 bunks, each with a real mattress, not straw, not bare planks, but actual cotton batting wrapped in ticking. Beside each bunk stood a small metal locker. The walls were insulated. At the far end, a coal stove waited for winter. The floor was wood, swept clean. Through the windows they could see the perimeter fence. Yes, barbed wire. Yes, guard towers. But also recreational areas, what appeared to be a soccer field, and buildings marked canteen, library, and infirmary. "They're fattening us for something," a voice said from the doorway. Lieutenant Werner Brandt, an infantry officer with 3 years on the Eastern Front, surveyed the room with suspicious eyes. "This is too comfortable. They'll work us to death in their factories, you'll see, or use us for medical experiments." But the experiments never came. The death work never materialized. Instead, over the following days and weeks, a strange new routine established itself, one that bore no resemblance to the grim fate the men had anticipated. The first shock came at breakfast. Klaus had expected watery soup, moldy bread. The starvation rations he had heard characterized Soviet treatment of German prisoners. He had steeled himself for hunger, for the slow weakening of the body that precedes death. What he encountered instead in the mess hall of Camp Alva was abundance that bordered on the surreal. Scrambled eggs, real eggs, not powder, but eggs that had been broken that morning. Bacon, crispy, salty, glistening with fat. Fried potatoes, toast with butter. Coffee that was actually coffee, not roasted acorns or chicory. A pitcher of milk on each table, and portions that were not merely adequate but generous. Klaus stared at his tray, unable to move. Around him, 300 German POWs sat in similar paralysis. For most, this was more food than they had seen on a single plate in months, perhaps years. In the Afrika Korps, rations had been meager even before the final collapse. Water had been more precious than food. And here, in captivity, in the hands of the enemy, abundance. "It's a trick," Werner said, but even his voice lacked conviction. "They'll fatten us this week, then starve us next month." But next month came, and the food remained. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, each meal substantial, varied, nutritious. The American adherence to the Geneva Convention was not abstract. It was 3 times daily, 7 days a week, measured in calories and vitamins and protein. The stipulation was clear. POWs were to receive the same rations as American soldiers at base camps. And so they did. By August, Klaus had gained 17 pounds. His wounded leg continued to heal. The American doctors at the camp infirmary monitoring his progress with professional detachment that was itself remarkable. They treated him not as a Nazi, not as an enemy, but as a patient. When an infection developed in the surgical wound, they administered sulfa drugs without hesitation, medications that were in short supply even for American civilians. When Klaus expressed shock at this, the camp doctor, a Captain Morrison from Minnesota, simply shrugged. "The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality, son. You're a human being who needs medical care. That's all that matters here. That's all that matters here." The words echoed in Klaus's mind as he lay in his bunk that night. What kind of enemy treated their prisoners' infections with expensive drugs? What kind of captor worried about a prisoner's weight gain and vitamin intake? The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Everything Klaus had been taught, everything he had believed about the Americans, about the racial inferiority of their mixed population, about the weakness of democracy, was colliding daily with undeniable reality. And reality was winning. By September, the work assignments began, not slave labor as they had feared, but voluntary work details governed by strict regulations. 80 cents per day for agricultural work in the surrounding farms. The money was real, credited to individual accounts, available for use in the camp canteen where POWs could purchase cigarettes, toiletries, candy, and other small luxuries. Some men refused to work on principle. They were not punished, not starved, not beaten. They simply remained in camp, reading books from the surprisingly well-stocked library, playing chess, organizing theatrical productions. Klaus volunteered, partially for the money, partially for something to do, but mostly because he was curious. What would this American labor look like? What would the farmers be like? He was assigned to a wheat farm owned by a family named Henderson, 20 miles west of Alva. On the first morning, a truck arrived with guards, not to watch him work, Klaus discovered, but to transport him there and back. At the farm, Mr. Henderson, a man in his 60s with hands scarred by decades of agricultural labor, greeted Klaus with a curt nod. "You know wheat?" Klaus, whose father had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, admitted he did not. "Well, you'll learn. Let's go." For 8 hours, Klaus worked alongside Henderson and his 2 teenage sons in the September heat, harvesting wheat with a mechanical efficiency that staggered him. The machinery, even on this modest family farm, was superior to anything he had seen in Germany. The abundance was visible everywhere, in the diesel fuel that powered the tractors without rationing, in the spare parts waiting in the barn, in the casual waste of resources that would have been hoarded religiously in Germany. At noon, Mrs. Henderson brought lunch to the fields. Sandwiches thick with roast beef, apples, cold milk, fresh-baked cookies. She served Klaus the same portion as her own sons. No hatred in her eyes, no resentment, just a farm wife doing what farm wives do, feeding workers. "You got people back in Germany?" she asked as Klaus ate. "My mother and sister in Hamburg." She nodded. "I hope they're safe. War's terrible for families." The simplicity of her compassion unmoored him. Here was an American woman whose own son, he'd seen the photograph in the house, was serving with the 8th Air Force, possibly dropping bombs on Hamburg at that very moment. Yet she could look at Klaus, see him as someone's son, someone's brother, and offer genuine hope for his family's safety. That night, riding back to camp in the truck, Klaus was silent. Otto, who had been assigned to a different farm, was ebullient. "The farmer paid me an extra $1 today. Can you believe it? Said I worked hard, deserved a bonus. A bonus for a prisoner." Werner, sitting across from them, remained skeptical. "They're buying us. Don't you see? This kindness, this money, it's psychological warfare. They want us to betray Germany." But the accusation rang hollow. No one was asking them to betray anything. No one pressured them for intelligence or propaganda statements. The Americans simply treated them according to the rules, and the rules, it turned out, were humane. Winter came. The Oklahoma cold was sharp and dry, nothing like the damp chill of northern Germany, but cold nonetheless. The POWs braced for deprivation, for the suffering that surely must come now that temperatures dropped below freezing. Instead, each man received a winter coat. Warm blankets appeared on the bunks. The coal stoves were kept supplied with fuel. Christmas 1943 brought a feast that seemed obscene in its plenty. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie, made with real sugar and butter. The camp allowed the POWs to organize their own Christmas celebration. They sang carols, performed a nativity play, read letters from home that had taken months to arrive through Red Cross channels. Klaus sat in the mess hall after the Christmas dinner, his stomach uncomfortably full, and tried to calculate the cognitive equation that refused to balance. By all reports filtering through the Red Cross, Germany was suffering. Cities were being bombed nightly. Food was rationed to near starvation levels. Civilians were dying. His mother's last letter, written in October, had mentioned hunger in careful, censored terms. And here he sat, a prisoner of Germany's enemies, having eaten more at one meal than his mother probably consumed in a week. The guilt was suffocating. The gratitude was undeniable. The two emotions coexisted in toxic proximity, creating a psychological pressure he had no tools to relieve. "My father," Otto said quietly beside him, "was in a Russian camp in the last war. He doesn't talk about it much, but once, when he was drunk, he told me they ate rats and boot leather and sawdust bread." Otto gestured at the half-eaten slice of pumpkin pie on his plate. "This isn't captivity. I don't know what it is, but it's not captivity." Lieutenant Brandt had grown quieter as the months passed, his certainty eroded by relentless evidence. Now he simply said, "It's the American way. They have so much they don't know how to be poor, even with their prisoners." But Klaus suspected it was more than abundance. It was a choice. America could have treated them as Germany treated Russian prisoners, with deliberate cruelty, with calculated starvation, with ideological contempt. America had chosen not to, and that choice, that deliberate exercise of restraint and humanity, was more powerful than any propaganda. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. By spring of 1944, the men of Camp Alva had become something different from what they had been. Not traitors, they still considered themselves German soldiers, but witnesses to an alternative reality. Klaus now worked regularly at the Henderson farm. He had learned to drive a tractor, to repair machinery, to read the subtle signs of weather and soil. The Hendersons treated him with casual respect, neither overly friendly nor hostile. He was simply Klaus, the German fellow who helped with the harvest. Mrs. Henderson had taken to sending him back to camp with small gifts: a jar of preserves, a pair of warm socks she had knitted, a book she thought he might enjoy. In May, their son Robert came home on leave from the Army Air Force. Klaus had dreaded this moment, expecting confrontation, accusation. Robert Henderson had been flying bombing missions over Germany. His B-17 had taken flak over Bremen, not far from Hamburg, not far from Klaus's mother and sister. The meeting happened at the farm. Klaus was repairing a fence post when Robert walked across the field with his father. The young pilot's uniform was crisp, his bearing military, his eyes haunted in a way Klaus recognized from his own mirror. "This the German POW you told me about?" Robert asked his father. "This is Klaus. Klaus, my son Robert." The two young men, both 24, both soldiers, both shaped and damaged by the same war, regarded each other across 3 feet of Oklahoma dirt. "Hamburg, huh?" Robert said finally. "We hit the docks there in March. Heavy flak." "My mother lives in Hamburg," Klaus replied in careful English, "near the port." A long silence. The wind moved through the wheat. Somewhere a meadowlark called. "I hope she's okay," Robert said, and the words carried no irony, no malice, just the exhausted sincerity of a man who had seen too much death and could not sustain hatred in the face of another human being's obvious fear. "I hope you stay safe," Klaus replied, and meant it. They worked together that day, the American bomber pilot and the German infantry soldier, repairing fence posts on a farm in Oklahoma, while their respective nations tried to obliterate each other across the Atlantic. That evening, Mrs. Henderson took a photograph, her son and Klaus, standing side by side, tools in hand, squinting into the late afternoon sun. Two young men who should have been enemies briefly suspended in a moment of improbable peace. Klaus would keep that photograph for the rest of his life. News from Europe filtered in through the summer and fall of 1944. D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the retreat toward Germany's borders. In the camp, the POWs listened to the radio broadcasts. The Americans did not censor this and grappled with their complex emotions. Part of them hoped Germany would somehow prevail. Part of them understood that Germany was losing, and a growing part of them wondered what they were fighting for at all. The doubts had been seeded by small things. A guard who learned German so he could talk with the prisoners about philosophy. A teacher from the local town who volunteered to give English lessons. The camp commander who allowed POWs to organize a camp newspaper printed on a mimeograph machine where they could express their thoughts within reasonable bounds. The dentist who fixed Klaus's broken molar without charge, simply because a human being should not have to suffer with a broken tooth. None of these were grand gestures, none were propaganda victories. They were simply acts of baseline human decency, extended across enemy lines over and over until the cumulative weight of them became undeniable. By December 1944, Klaus Hartmann no longer believed the stories he had been told about American savagery. He no longer believed in the racial theories that had been drilled into him during training. How could he, when the mongrel democracy he had been taught to despise was treating him with more humanity than his own government had treated its own citizens? The cognitive revolution was complete, though he struggled to articulate it even to himself. In the privacy of his bunk, he would run through the evidence like a prosecutor building an impossible case. The surgery that saved his leg, the food that restored his health, the work that paid him wages, the farmers who treated him with respect, the pilot who wished his mother safety, the guards who learned his language, the system, the entire bureaucratic, legal, constitutional system that insisted he be treated according to rules, even when violating those rules would have been easier, cheaper, more emotionally satisfying for his captors. This was not weakness. This was something else, something he had no word for in German, something that had to do with law, with principle, with the strange American faith that rules mattered more than convenience, that humanity could be systematized, that even enemies deserved dignity. The war ended in May 1945. The news came over the radio. Hitler dead. Germany surrendered. Europe in ruins. In Camp Alva, the reaction was muted. No celebrations, but also no displays of continued defiance. Just quiet conversations, private grief, and the slow absorption of reality. Klaus would not return home for 18 months. Repatriation was a slow process, complicated by the chaos of post-war Europe. He remained in Oklahoma through the summer and fall of 1945, through the winter of 1946, working at the Henderson farm, saving his wages, reading everything he could find about America, its history, its founding documents, its strange commitment to ideas over blood. When he finally boarded the ship for Germany in September 1946, he carried with him $63.50 in saved wages, a letter of recommendation from Mr. Henderson, 3 books from the camp library the commander had allowed him to keep, and the photograph of himself and Robert Henderson standing beside a fence post. He also carried something less tangible, a restructured worldview. The man who had pressed his face into Tunisian sand in March 1943, certain of his death at enemy hands, had been obliterated as thoroughly as any artillery barrage could have accomplished. What remained was someone different, someone who had seen the alternative. Hamburg, October 1946. The city was ruins. Entire neighborhoods existed only as rubble fields where children played in the skeletons of buildings. His mother's apartment building had survived, though the windows were still boarded where glass had shattered during the firestorm of 1943. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair completely gray now, her hands constantly trembling. "The last years," she said simply, not elaborating, not needing to. Klaus unpacked his small bag. He gave her $30, half his savings. He gave her the jar of preserves Mrs. Henderson had sent as a gift. He showed her the photograph. "This is the American pilot. The one whose bombs—" "Yes." His mother studied the photograph for a long time. Two young men, smiling awkwardly, holding tools. She touched the image gently. "You look healthy there, happy almost." "I was treated well, Mama. Better than I had any right to expect." She set the photograph on the mantel, beside the picture of Klaus's father, dead since 1938. She did not ask detailed questions. She did not interrogate his experience. She simply held him for a long moment, grateful he was alive, grateful he was home. That night, lying in his childhood bed, Klaus listened to the sounds of post-war Hamburg, distant hammering as people worked to rebuild, a woman crying in the apartment above, footsteps of occupation soldiers on patrol. Tomorrow he would begin the work of rebuilding his own life, finding employment, navigating the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich, figuring out who Klaus Hartmann could become in a world where Klaus Hartmann's old certainties had been obliterated. But tonight, in the darkness, his mind kept returning to Oklahoma, to the taste of Mrs. Henderson's roast beef, to the sound of the tractor engine, to the camp library where he had discovered Twain and Whitman and Lincoln, to the surgeon who had said, "You're lucky, Jerry. We'll get you patched up," to the simple revolutionary fact of having been treated as a human being by people who had every reason to treat him otherwise. Klaus Hartmann lived until 2009, dying at the age of 88 in a nursing home in Bremen. He married, raised 3 children, worked as an administrator for the Marshall Plan Office, and later as a translator. He never returned to America, though he followed its news closely, its struggles and triumphs, its failures and redemptions. He told his story sparingly. The war generation did not dwell on the past, finding it too painful, too complicated, too implicated in horrors that defied comprehension. But occasionally, when his grandchildren asked about the war, he would pull out the photograph. 2 young men beside a fence post in Oklahoma. "I was captured here," he would say, pointing to a map of Tunisia. "And I was saved here," pointing to Oklahoma. "The Americans could have let me die. The infection in my leg should have killed me. Instead, they operated immediately. No waiting line. No consideration of whether I was worth the medicine. I was just a patient who needed help." "And they fed you?" his granddaughter asked once. She had grown up in prosperous post-war Germany and could not imagine hunger. "Fed us the same rations as their own soldiers. It was written in their rules, and they followed their rules. This was not generosity, you understand. It was principle. They had written down how prisoners must be treated, and they treated us that way, even when we did not deserve it." "Did you feel grateful?" Klaus considered the question. "I felt confused, then guilty, then grateful, then something else, something I still don't have a good word for. The Americans showed me that the enemy I had been told about, the weak, decadent, racially inferior democracy, did not exist. What existed instead was a country that could be decent even to its enemies, not because it was weak, but because it had decided that some principles mattered more than vengeance." He would pause then, looking at the photograph. "I learned more about morality in that prison camp than in all my years of school and Hitler Youth. I learned it from people who had every reason to hate me, showing me humanity I did not deserve." In his final year, when his memory had begun to fail and the present grew confused, Klaus's mind would wander back to Oklahoma with crystalline clarity. He could taste Mrs. Henderson's apple pie. He could feel the vibration of the tractor engine. He could hear Mr. Henderson's voice. "You got people back in Germany? I hope they're safe." The hospitable captivity. The strange American contradiction. The nation that could marshal industrial might to crush its enemies, yet insisted on treating those same enemies with dignity once they were defeated. It was not weakness, it was not naivety, it was something profoundly American, a belief that law transcended circumstance, that humanity could be codified, that even in war some things remained sacred. Klaus Hartmann had gone to war believing in racial destiny and inevitable triumph. He had come home believing in the possibility of redemption, in the power of principle, in the revolutionary idea that enemies were still human beings. The Americans had not converted him through propaganda or pressure. They had simply treated him according to their rules, and those rules had been more powerful than any ideology. In the end, that was the lesson he carried from the wire and the watchtowers, from the wheat fields and the camp mess hall. That civilization was not about strength or purity or destiny. It was about choosing to be decent when decency was not required. It was about saving the leg of a wounded enemy. It was about following rules even when breaking them would be easier. It was about the radical proposition that some obligations transcended nationality, transcended war, transcended even the reasonable desire for vengeance. The hospitable captivity had been no captivity at all. It had been an education in what humanity could be, delivered by a nation that chose principle over expedience, even toward those who had sought its destruction. And that education, bitter and beautiful, had lasted a lifetime.